Hey there. Tonight, we're pushing through the swinging doors of a place you think you know, a cornerstone of American mythology, the Old West Saloon. We're not here for the gunfights or the poker games. We're here for the food. We have this image of a dusty cowboy sidling up to the bar for a shot of whiskey and a thick, juicy steak. But the truth, as it so often is, was far grubbier, far less appetizing, and infinitely more dangerous to your digestive system. The food in a typical frontier saloon wasn't just bad, it was a testament to human endurance, a culinary landscape of desperation, salt, and profound bacterial courage. So before you imagine a hearty meal, I want you to know that you probably wouldn't have survived the free lunch, let alone enjoyed it. If this kind of calm, slow, and unglamorous history helps you unwind and drift off, feel free to like the video and subscribe. But please, only if it genuinely brings you a bit of peace. I'm always fascinated to see where these stories land, so if you'd like, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's a strange and wonderful thing to see who is out there, settling in for the same quiet tale. Now, dim the lights. If you have a fan, maybe turn it on for that soft, steady background hum. Find a comfortable position, and let's ease into a world where the whiskey burned, the piano was out of tune, and the stew had seen better days. Many, many better days. Before we can even talk about the food, you have to understand the hunger. Not the simple, pleasant appetite you feel before dinner. This is a deeper, more primal state of being. You have to imagine what it felt like to arrive in a dusty cow town in 1880, not as a tourist, but as a survivor. For the past 3 months, you've been on a cattle drive. Your world has been reduced to the back of a horse, the endless sea of dusty cattle, and a sky so vast it could swallow you whole. Your diet has been a monotonous, soul-crushing rotation of 3 things: beans, biscuits, and bitter coffee. You've eaten beans until your insides ache with a dull, gassy pressure. You've gnawed on biscuits so hard they could have been used to stone a sinner. You've drunk coffee that was more sludge than liquid, a bitter jolt of caffeine that did little to mask the profound exhaustion settled deep in your bones. You haven't seen a fresh vegetable in 90 days. The very concept of fruit is a distant, dreamlike memory from another life. Your body is in a state of quiet rebellion. Your gums might be a little tender, an early warning sign of scurvy. A small cut you got on your hand 2 weeks ago has refused to heal, a testament to a body running on fumes, deprived of the basic nutrients it needs to repair itself. This is a hunger that goes beyond your stomach. It's a hunger for flavor, for variety, for something that doesn't taste of salt, grease, and dust. It's a hunger for comfort. You dream of food, not complicated dishes, but simple, impossible luxuries. A crisp apple, a slice of soft bread, a glass of cool, clean water. You are also physically depleted. You've been in the saddle for 10 to 12 hours a day, every day. You've endured scorching sun, sudden hailstorms, and nights so cold your bones felt like ice. You are thinner than when you started, not a lean, muscular thin, but a weary, sinewy thinness born of hard labor and poor nutrition. So when you finally see the ramshackle outline of a town on the horizon, it feels like a mirage, a fever dream. The promise of that town isn't just about getting paid, it's about the promise of a real meal, a real drink, a real bed. The hope is so intense it's a physical ache, a sharp pang of longing in your chest. You are primed for disappointment. Your desperate hunger makes you the perfect customer for the frontier saloon. You are not looking for quality. You are not looking for hygiene. You are looking for anything that will fill the cavernous emptiness inside you. You are tired, you are dirty, you are malnourished, and you are about to walk into an establishment whose entire business model is built on your desperation. As you ride closer, the smell of the town hits you, a pungent cocktail of stockyards, manure, and coal smoke. It doesn't deter you. Nothing could deter you. Your focus is singular. You see the false-fronted building with the swinging doors and the crudely painted sign that says Saloon. To you, in this moment, it looks like the gates of paradise. You are about to learn that even paradise has its price, and it's often paid with a night of profound indigestion and deep, abiding regret. The road has been long and hard, and the saloon is waiting. It knows you're coming, it knows you're hungry, and it doesn't care. The town is less a community and more a temporary processing zone for cattle and cowboys. It huddles on the vast, empty plain like a collection of driftwood washed ashore. The main street is a wide, unpaved scar of churned mud and dried manure, a testament to the thousands of cattle that have passed through. When the wind blows, which is always, it kicks up a fine, gritty dust that coats everything, including the inside of your mouth. You ride slowly down this street, your horse as weary as you are. The buildings are almost all wooden, hastily erected, with a shocking disregard for aesthetics or longevity. They are temporary structures for a temporary boom. The most prominent buildings are the ones designed to take your money. The general store, the land office, the hotel, and of course the saloons. There are so many saloons, sometimes 4 or 5 in a single block, each one competing for your attention and your hard-earned wages. From the outside, the saloon tries to project an image of prosperity and welcome. It might be the only 2-story building in town, a towering monument to vice. It has a false front, a tall, flat facade, designed to make the building look grander and more important than it actually is. It's a piece of architectural trickery, a wooden lie in a town built on them. The name of the establishment is painted in bold, hopeful letters. The Golden Nugget, the Palace, the Alhambra. The names promise opulence, excitement, a taste of a more civilized world. Below the name, there might be other enticing words: wines, liqueurs, cigars, and sometimes, the most alluring promise of all, free lunch. Those 2 words are a siren song to a man in your condition. Free lunch. It seems too good to be true, a miracle in this dusty, unforgiving world. You've been living on $1 a day for months, and the idea of getting something for nothing is intoxicating. The saloon has swinging doors, the iconic batwing doors of the myth. They are designed not for dramatic entrances, but to provide ventilation and a modicum of privacy while still allowing potential customers to peer inside and see the activity. You might see men leaning against the bar, hear the clink of glasses, the murmur of conversation, and maybe the tinny, out-of-tune notes of a piano. It all seems impossibly glamorous from the outside. There are likely a few horses tied to a hitching rail out front, their heads drooping in the heat. A couple of other cowboys, fresh off the trail like you, might be lounging on the wooden boardwalk, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. You swing down from your horse, your legs stiff and clumsy after so long in the saddle. The ground feels strange and unsteady beneath your boots. You tie your horse to the rail, giving it a final, weary pat. Your entire world for the past 3 months has been the open sky and the company of cattle. Now, you stand before a door that promises to lead you back into the world of men. You take a deep breath, the dusty air filling your lungs, and you push through the swinging doors. You are leaving the vast, honest emptiness of the prairie and entering a small, dark, and profoundly dishonest room. The food is waiting, or rather, it is festering. The moment you step through the swinging doors, your senses are assaulted. The change from the bright, open prairie to the dark, enclosed space of the saloon is jarring. It takes a moment for your eyes to adjust to the gloom. The air inside is thick, heavy, and layered with a century of smells that have soaked into the wooden walls and floor. The primary scent is stale beer and cheap whiskey. It's a sour, fermented smell, the ghost of 1,000 spilled drinks. Underneath that is the thick, acrid haze of tobacco smoke. Cigars, pipes, and hand-rolled cigarettes are being smoked by nearly every man in the room. The smoke hangs in the air like a low-lying fog, catching the few beams of light that pierce the gloom from the dirty windows. It stings your eyes and catches in the back of your throat. Then there is the smell of humanity. The unwashed bodies of dozens of men cowboys, miners, gamblers, and drifters all packed into a poorly ventilated space. It's the smell of sweat, grime, and desperation. Mingled with that is the faint, sweet, cloying scent of the cheap perfume worn by the saloon girls. And somewhere in that olfactory chaos is the smell of the food. It is not the appetizing aroma of a home-cooked meal. It is a strange, ambiguous smell. The metallic tang of old meat, the sharp scent of vinegar from pickled items, and the dull, earthy smell of a stew that has been simmering for an impossibly long time. It's a smell that doesn't invite appetite so much as it dares you to be hungry enough to ignore it. The room itself is a study in crude functionality. The floor is covered in sawdust, which is there to soak up spilled liquor, tobacco spit, and the occasional splash of blood. It is rarely changed, and over time, it has become a compacted, filthy mat of wood shavings and human effluvia. Along the wall runs the bar, a long plank of dark, scarred wood, sticky to the touch. Behind it, A large, ornate mirror, probably the most expensive object in the room, is clouded with grime and smoke. It reflects a distorted, murky version of the scene before you. Bottles of anonymous liquor are lined up on shelves, their labels faded and their contents suspect. The lighting is minimal. A few kerosene lamps hang from the ceiling, their glass chimneys coated with soot casting a flickering yellow-orange glow over the room. The corners are lost in shadow, providing a sense of anonymity that is both comforting and menacing. The sound is a low, constant murmur of male voices, punctuated by the sharp click of poker chips, the clink of glasses, and the occasional burst of loud, drunken laughter. If there is a piano, its music is a tinny, repetitive melody, a lonely soundtrack to the quiet desperation in the room. The patrons are a cross-section of frontier society. You see other cowboys, their faces sunburned and windburned, their movements slow and deliberate. You see prospectors, their clothes caked with the dirt of their claims, their eyes holding a wild, hopeful gleam. You see professional gamblers, dressed a little better than everyone else, their faces impassive, their eyes constantly scanning the room for a new mark. You see the town loafers, the drifters, the men with no past and no future, who nurse a single beer for hours, just to be in a place that is warm and out of the wind. This is not a place of joy. It is a place of transaction. Everything here is for sale. The liquor, the games of chance, the company of the women, and even, in a way, a temporary escape from the crushing loneliness of your life. It feels charged with a low-grade tension, a sense that violence could erupt at any moment over a spilled drink, a card game, or a sideways glance. You make your way to the bar, your boots sticking slightly to the grimy floor. The bartender, a large man with a weary face and a stained apron, gives you a non-committal nod. You have arrived. And at the far end of the bar, you see it, the source of that strange, compelling smell, the free lunch. The man behind the bar is the heart and soul of the saloon. He is the proprietor, the bartender, the bouncer, and the confessor, all rolled into one. He is not the friendly, talkative bartender of fiction. He is a hardened businessman in a tough business. His name might be Gus or Mac, and he has seen it all. He has seen men get rich at the card table and lose it all an hour later. He has seen fights start over nothing and end in death. He has mopped up blood, listened to drunken sorrows, and thrown countless men out into the muddy street. Nothing surprises him anymore. His face is a mask of professional indifference. He serves you your drink without a word, his movements efficient and practiced. He knows you are a cowboy, fresh off the trail, with money in your pocket and a powerful thirst. You are not a person to him, you are a customer, a source of revenue. His job is to keep you drinking. The more you drink, the more money he makes. It's that simple. He is also the guardian of the saloon's unwritten rules. He knows how to spot a card cheat, how to de-escalate a drunken argument, and when to reach for the sawed-off shotgun he keeps under the bar. He is the ultimate authority in this small, chaotic kingdom. His word is law. Crossing him is a mistake you will only make once. Then there are the saloon girls, or soiled doves. The myth paints them as tragic figures with hearts of gold, or as glamorous, independent women. The reality was usually much bleaker. Most were young women who had been trapped by poverty, abandonment, or abuse. A saloon offered one of the few ways for a woman to earn a living on the frontier, but it came at a tremendous cost. Their job was multifaceted. They served drinks, they danced with the customers, and they provided company, which was a euphemism for prostitution. They were paid a commission on the drinks they could persuade the customers to buy, which were often outrageously priced. The more you drank with them, the more money the house made. They projected an image of gaiety and flirtation, but behind their painted smiles was often a story of hardship and exploitation. They were vulnerable to violence from drunken customers and to abuse from the saloon owner, who often acted as their pimp. Disease was a constant threat, and their life expectancy was tragically short. For every soiled dove who managed to save enough money to escape the life, there were 100 who died young from illness, addiction, or violence. And who is in charge of the food? There is no chef in the modern sense. The free lunch is likely prepared by the bartender himself during a slow period, or by a swamper, the low-level employee who is responsible for cleaning the saloon, stoking the fire, and doing all the other thankless jobs. This is not a person with culinary training. This is a person whose primary qualification is being willing to work for next to nothing. The food is prepared in a back room that would make a modern health inspector faint. There is no running water, no refrigeration, no concept of sanitation. Ingredients are stored in open barrels, accessible to rats and insects. The cooking is done on a simple wood-burning stove. The person preparing your food has likely not washed their hands all day. They are handling dirty glasses, cleaning up tobacco spit, and then turning to slice the questionable sausage that you are about to eat. The staff of the saloon is a reflection of the establishment itself. They are there to perform a function to facilitate a transaction. The bartender provides the alcohol, the girls provide the illusion of companionship, and the swamper provides the food that will keep you thirsty. It is a cynical, efficient ecosystem designed for one purpose: to extract the maximum amount of profit from your momentary desire for escape. They are not your friends. They are not there to ensure you have a good time. They are simply the cogs in the machine that is about to fleece you. You approach the end of the bar where the free lunch is laid out. It is the answer to the prayers your starving body has been whispering for months. It is free. It is food. It is here. But you are about to learn the first and most important rule of the frontier economy. Nothing is free. The free lunch was a brilliant marketing innovation, a piece of commercial genius that thrived in the saloons of the American West from the 1870s to the early 1900s. The concept was simple: provide a spread of food at no cost to any customer who purchased a drink. The goal was not an act of charity. It was a calculated business strategy designed to achieve two things: attract customers into your saloon instead of the one next door, and, most importantly, make them so thirsty that they would buy more drinks. The entire spread was an exercise in salt. Every single item on that free buffet was engineered to dry out your mouth and create a raging, unquenchable thirst. It was a culinary trap, and you, with your trail-honed hunger, were walking right into it. The saloon owner wasn't losing money on the food. The ingredients were the cheapest he could possibly find. The meat was heavily salted to preserve it. The crackers were dry and salty. The pickled items were swimming in a salty brine. He might spend $1 on the entire spread for the day, but a single customer, lured in by the promise of a free meal, might buy 2 or 3 nickel beers, or a 10-cent whiskey to wash it down. The profit margin was enormous. The lunch was typically available during the busiest parts of the day, usually around noon, to attract laborers, and again in the evening. It was not an all-you-can-eat affair. There was a strict, unspoken etiquette. You were expected to buy a drink first. Then you could approach the lunch counter. You were expected to take a reasonable portion, not to load up your plate as if you were preparing for another 3 months on the trail. Taking too much was a serious breach of decorum and could get you thrown out. The saloon owner was not your friend. He was a businessman. The free lunch was a loss leader, a tool to get you in the door and open your wallet. It created a sense of obligation. He had given you something for free, so you felt compelled to buy another drink and another. It was a subtle, psychological manipulation that worked with devastating efficiency on men who were lonely, thirsty, and grateful for any small act of perceived kindness. There was no choice in this meal. You ate what was provided. There were no special requests, no dietary considerations. You took the salty sausage, the stale crackers, and the vinegary egg, and you were grateful for it. The illusion was that you were getting a meal for the price of a beer. The reality was that you were paying for the food many times over in the drinks you consumed to counteract its effects. This was the cynical genius of the saloon economy. It understood the basic human needs for food, drink, and companionship, and it monetized them with ruthless efficiency. The free lunch was not a meal. It was bait. And as you stand there, your mouth watering at the sight of something, anything, that isn't trail biscuits, you are the fish, about to swallow the hook, the line, and the sinker. You order your first beer, and you step up to the counter. The trap is sprung. At the heart of many a free lunch counter, simmering in a large, dark pot over a low flame, was the stew. This was not a fresh, lovingly prepared dish. This was the saloon's living, breathing, and endlessly evolving solution to the problem of leftovers. This was the eternal stew. The concept was gruesomely practical. Nothing was ever thrown away. At the end of the day, any unsold food from the lunch counter, any scraps from the paid meals, any bits and pieces that were too small or too unappetizing to be served on their own, were all scraped into the pot. A little water was added, the fire was stoked, and the pot was left to simmer through the night. In the morning, the cycle began again. The pot was never fully emptied. It was a continuous, self-perpetuating entity. Today's stew contained the remnants of yesterday's stew, which contained the ghosts of the stew from the day before that. It was less a recipe and more a culinary timeline, a liquid history of the saloon's kitchen. What exactly was in it? The better question is, what wasn't? The base was likely a thin, watery broth, flavored with the salt and grease of its many ingredients. Floating in this murky liquid was a depressing collage of culinary cast-offs, chunks of yesterday's questionable sausage, the dried-out ends of a roast, a few boiled potatoes that had gone soft, the heel of a loaf of stale bread dissolving into a mushy cloud, maybe a wilted carrot or a sad-looking onion. But the real mystery was the meat. If a customer had paid for a steak and left a few gristly bits on his plate, into the pot they went. If the venison from last week was starting to turn, it was diced up and added, the long simmering process hopefully boiling away the taste of incipient rot. Sometimes, the meat's origin was a complete enigma. Rabbit? Squirrel? A prairie dog that had met an untimely end in the saloon's back alley? As long as it could be chewed, it was a candidate for the stew. The flavor profile of the eternal stew was, to put it mildly, complex. It was salty, of course. Everything was salty. It was greasy, with a slick of fat shimmering on its surface. It was also unpredictable. One spoonful might yield a surprisingly tasty piece of beef. The next might contain a rubbery piece of gristle or a chunk of something with an unidentifiable, slightly gamey flavor that you tried not to think about too hard. The texture was uniformly soft, everything cooked down to a homogeneous, pulpy mass. It required little chewing, which was a blessing for the many cowboys who suffered from painful dental problems. It was served warm, and on a cold day, the heat of it was its most appealing quality. From a sanitation standpoint, the eternal stew was a microbiological adventure playground. The constant simmering might have killed some of the bacteria, but the pot was a welcoming environment for the hardier, more heat-resistant strains. It was never refrigerated. It sat out for hours, a lukewarm buffet for flies and other airborne contaminants. The ladle used to serve it was likely just rinsed in the same tub of greasy water used for the glasses. Eating the eternal stew was an act of faith, or perhaps desperation. You were trusting that the alcohol in your stomach would be strong enough to kill whatever was living in that pot. Sometimes you were right. Sometimes you were very, very wrong. A bowl of the free stew could lead to a night of violent stomach cramps, a condition the cowboys grimly referred to as the trots. And yet, you ate it. It was hot. It was filling. It was free. You spooned the lumpy brown liquid into your mouth, trying to identify the various shapes and textures, and then deciding it was better not to know. You soaked up the last of the broth with a piece of stale cracker, and you felt a small, fleeting sense of gratitude. Your stomach was full. For now, the stew had provided. And tomorrow, it would be there again, slightly different, yet exactly the same, waiting for the next hungry, unsuspecting cowboy to arrive. Beside the simmering pot of mystery stew, the most reliable feature of the free lunch counter was the bread. But this was not the warm, crusty, artisanal loaf you might imagine. This was bread in its most basic, functional, and often depressing form. Its primary purpose was not to be enjoyed, but to serve as a vehicle for other, saltier things, and to provide cheap, starchy bulk to fill your empty stomach. Most often, what was on offer were crackers. These were not the light, flaky crackers of the modern snack aisle. These were hardtack, or something very close to it. Hardtack was the legendary staple of sailors and soldiers, a simple, unleavened biscuit made from flour, water, and salt. It was baked until it was bone dry and rock hard, a process that made it incredibly durable and resistant to spoilage. A piece of hardtack from the Civil War era could, in theory, still be edible today, though you would likely break a tooth trying to eat it. These crackers were served in a large wooden barrel, or tin, where customers could help themselves. They were dry, tasteless, and, as the name implies, incredibly hard. You didn't bite into a piece of saloon hardtack. You negotiated with it. You would break off a piece and let it soak in your beer or your stew, hoping it would soften to a consistency that wouldn't shatter your molars. The flavor was a faint, dusty taste of old flour and salt. The crackers served another, more subtle purpose in the saloon's grand strategy. They were incredibly dry, and eating them would suck every last drop of moisture from your mouth, further fueling the desperate thirst that the saloon owner was so keen to cultivate. Each salty, dusty bite was an invitation to order another beer. Sometimes, instead of crackers, there would be actual bread. But again, this was a far cry from a fresh-baked loaf. It was likely day old, or several days old, bread purchased cheaply from the town's bakery. It was dense, heavy, and chewy, with a thick, tough crust. The saloon owner was not paying for premium quality. He was buying the leftovers, the bread that was too stale to be sold to paying customers. It was sliced thick and laid out on a platter. You would take a slice and use it as a plate, piling it high with pickled meats or soaking it in the eternal stew. This was the origin of the trencher, a medieval practice that survived on the frontier out of pure practicality. The quality of this bread was highly variable. Sometimes it was merely stale. Other times it was actively hostile. You might find patches of green or blue mold, which you would discreetly cut or scrape off. You might bite into it and discover that it had been infested with weevils, the tiny insects leaving a network of tunnels in the loaf. You would try to ignore the extra, unwanted protein. In the worst establishments, the bread was little more than a sawdust loaf. Unscrupulous bakers would mix sawdust, chalk, or other fillers into the flour to stretch their supply and increase their profits. This bread was heavy, gritty, and almost completely indigestible. It filled your stomach like a rock, but provided little to no nutritional value. There was no butter for your bread. Butter was a perishable luxury, far too expensive to be given away for free. You ate your bread plain, dry, and unadorned. It was a tool, not a treat. It was a sponge for grease and brine, a platform for salt, a dense, starchy mass to quiet the rumbling in your gut. As you stood at the bar, gnawing on a piece of cracker that felt like a piece of wood, you were participating in a long and storied tradition of survival eating. This was not food for pleasure. This was food as fuel, in its most rudimentary and uninspiring form. Each bite was a small, dusty battle, and with each swallow you could feel your thirst growing, which of course was the entire point. The bread was the foundation of the free lunch, a stale, salty, and brutally effective foundation. If the stew was the heart of the free lunch, and the bread was its foundation, then the meats were its salty, mysterious soul. This was where the saloon owner's genius for preservation and thirst induction truly shone. There were no fresh-cooked roasts or delicate slices of ham. The meat selection on a free lunch counter was a veritable museum of pickling, salting, and smoking ancient techniques used to make meat last for months without refrigeration, and incidentally, to make it so salty it could desiccate a mummy. Let's begin with the items you might find floating in large, cloudy glass jars. The most common of these were pickled eggs. A hard-boiled egg, stripped of its shell, and left to soak for weeks in a jar of vinegar and brine. The vinegar would turn the egg white rubbery and the yolk chalky, all while infusing it with a sharp, pungent, and intensely salty flavour. Biting into one was a jarring experience, a sour, salty assault on the senses. But it was protein, and it was free. You'd fish one out of the jar with a pair of communal tongs, the cold, slimy egg dripping brine onto your plate. In another jar, you might find pickled pig's feet. This was a true frontier delicacy, born of the necessity to use every single part of the animal. The pig's feet were boiled until tender, then submerged in the same vinegary brine as the eggs. The result was a gelatinous, fatty, and strangely compelling concoction. The texture was an acquired taste, a mixture of soft skin, chewy cartilage, and tiny bones. The flavour was overwhelmingly sour and salty. It was not a dish for the faint of heart, but for a hungry cowboy, it was a welcome source of fat and calories. Then there was the sausage. Not fresh, sizzling sausage, but long, thin, dark sticks of dried and cured meat. This could be anything from a relatively benign summer sausage to a salami of deeply mysterious origins. These sausages were heavily spiced, not for flavour, but to mask the taste of the low-quality meat and to aid in the preservation process. They were also incredibly salty. A single bite would have you reaching for your beer mug. They were hard and chewy, and you would slice off a small piece with your pocket knife, chewing on it for a long time to break it down. You might also find a plate of sliced bologna or other preserved luncheon meats. These were factory-produced products from back east, packed in salt and preservatives, and shipped west in barrels. The meat was a uniform pinkish-grey colour, with a smooth, slightly slimy texture. The flavour was overwhelmingly of salt and chemical preservatives. It bore little resemblance to any meat you might recognise from a farm. Sometimes there was fish. Not fresh fish, of course, but salted or pickled herring. These small, oily fish were packed in barrels of salt and could last for years. The saloon owner would rinse some of the salt off and lay them out on a plate. They were intensely fishy and so salty they would make your eyes water. But again, they were a potent thirst generator and a cheap source of protein. Finally, there was the cheese. This was not a fine, aged cheddar. This was saloon cheese or rat cheese, a hard, dry, and incredibly sharp block of cheese, often orange in colour. It was salty, crumbly, and had a pungent aroma that could fill a room. It was called rat cheese because it was the kind of cheap, hard cheese often used in rat traps. It was rarely covered, sitting out on the counter all day, exposed to flies and dust, its edges growing hard and dark. You'd hack off a small piece with the communal knife, a knife whose handle was sticky with the grease and grime of 100 other unwashed hands. Every item on this carnivorous spread was a marvel of preservation and a weapon in the saloon's war against your sobriety. Each piece of meat was a salt bomb, designed to explode in your mouth and leave you gasping for liquid. As you assembled your small, sad, meal a rubbery egg, a slice of mystery sausage, a piece of sharp cheese, all resting on a slab of stale bread, you were consuming a history of food preservation. You were eating the ingenuity of necessity, the flavors of survival, and you were getting very, very thirsty. As you survey the offerings on the free lunch counter, a strange realization begins to dawn on you. Amidst the various shades of brown, beige, and murky grey, there is a conspicuous absence of colour. Specifically, there is an almost complete lack of green. In the world of the saloon free lunch, vegetables were not just a low priority, they were practically non-existent. For a man who had just spent months on a cattle drive, subsisting on a diet devoid of fresh produce, the saloon offered no relief. The business model of the free lunch was built on cheap, durable, and salty ingredients. Fresh vegetables were none of these things. They were perishable, expensive to transport to remote frontier towns, and worst of all, they didn't make you thirsty. A crisp stalk of celery or a fresh slice of tomato would have been hydrating, counteracting the saloon owner's primary business objective. So, what passed for vegetables on this sad buffet? The selection was meagre and almost exclusively pickled. The most common offering was a large jar of pickled onions. Small, white onions were peeled and submerged in a vinegar brine, where they would sit for weeks, becoming soft, translucent, and intensely sour. They provided a sharp, acidic crunch that could cut through the grease of the meats, but they offered little in the way of nutrition. You might also find a bowl of coleslaw, but this was not the creamy, sweet slaw of a modern picnic. This was a harsh, vinegary concoction, made from shredded cabbage that was often limp and slightly brown around the edges. It was dressed with little more than vinegar, salt, and maybe a pinch of sugar. It was a dish designed to last for days on the counter without spoiling, its sharp flavour another goad to your thirst. Sometimes there were potatoes, boiled potatoes to be exact. They were often part of the eternal stew, but occasionally a bowl of them would be set out on their own. They were unseasoned, unbuttered, and cooked until they were soft and watery. They were a source of cheap calories, a starchy filler, but they offered little in the way of flavour or culinary excitement. And that was usually it. There were no fresh greens, no salads, no steamed vegetables. The concept of eating raw vegetables was largely alien on the frontier. They were considered difficult to digest and were almost always cooked, often boiled for hours, until any nutritional value had been leached out into the water, which was then discarded. This profound lack of fresh produce in the diet of the average cowboy or frontier labourer had serious health consequences. Scurvy, the debilitating disease caused by a lack of vitamin C, was a constant threat. The early symptoms were fatigue, joint pain, and irritability. As it progressed, the gums would become swollen, purple, and spongy, bleeding at the slightest touch. Teeth would loosen and fall out. Old wounds would reopen. Eventually it could lead to internal hemorrhaging and death. While scurvy was more common on long sea voyages, it was a real and present danger for men on long cattle drives or those wintering in remote mining camps. They knew the symptoms, which they called blackleg, but they didn't understand the cause. They attributed it to bad air, tainted food, or simple bad luck. They didn't know that a single orange or a handful of fresh greens could have cured it. The saloon, the supposed bastion of civilization at the end of the trail, did nothing to alleviate this nutritional crisis. In fact, it perpetuated it. By offering a meal that was completely devoid of essential vitamins, it contributed to the poor health of its patrons. So as you stand at the lunch counter, You are faced with a choice between the familiar emptiness of a vegetable-free diet and a few pickled items that offered a jolt of sourness but little else. You might take a pickled onion, its sharp flavor a welcome shock to a palate dulled by months of beans and biscuits. But it does nothing to replenish the vitamins your body is crying out for. You are filling your stomach, but you are not nourishing your body. You are simply postponing the inevitable reckoning of a diet built on salt, starch, and preserved meat. The absence of vegetables on the saloon counter was not an oversight. It was a feature, a silent testament to a world where survival was measured in calories, not vitamins. The food before you is a landscape of blandness and salt. The stew is a murky brown, the crackers are a dusty beige, the pickled eggs a ghostly white. There is no freshness, no vibrancy, no complexity of flavor. There is only the brute force of salt and vinegar. To make this meal palatable, or even just to make it different from the meal you had yesterday, you need help, you need condiments. On the saloon bar, amidst the sticky rings of dried beer, you will find a small, sad collection of bottles and jars. These are the tools of flavor modification, the last line of defense against culinary monotony. But like everything else in the saloon, they are not what they seem. The most important of these is the bottle of hot pepper sauce. This was the cowboy's ketchup, his mustard, his everything sauce. A few dashes of this fiery liquid could transform a bowl of bland stew, mask the taste of slightly off meat, and provide a jolt of sensation that made you feel alive. The heat was a welcome distraction from the texture of a rubbery pig's foot or the chewiness of a piece of mystery sausage. The hot sauce of the era was not a carefully crafted artisanal product. It was a brutally simple concoction of chili peppers, vinegar, and salt, likely brewed in the back room by the saloon swamper. It was less about nuanced flavor and more about raw, punishing heat. A single drop could make you sweat and gasp for air, which, conveniently, would lead you to take a long, grateful swig of your beer. The hot sauce was not just a condiment, it was an integral part of the saloon's business model. Next to the hot sauce, you might find a bottle of ketchup. But this is not the thick, sweet, tomato-based ketchup of the 20th century. The ketchup of the 1880s was a thin, dark, and often pungent sauce that could be made from a variety of ingredients. The original ketchups were Asian fish sauces. In the West, they were more likely to be made from mushrooms, walnuts, or unripe tomatoes, heavily spiced with cloves, mace, and cayenne pepper. The flavor was savory, spicy, and slightly funky. It was also due to a lack of regulation, often filled with dangerous contaminants. Unscrupulous manufacturers used coal tar to give their ketchup a rich, red color, and preservatives like salicylic acid or boric acid in quantities that could be toxic. Your bottle of saloon ketchup was a gamble, a game of Russian roulette with your digestive system. There might also be a jar of mustard. This was typically a coarse-ground brown mustard, mixed with vinegar to create a sharp, pungent paste. It was strong enough to clear your sinuses and powerful enough to overwhelm the flavor of almost anything it was applied to, which was often its primary purpose. A thick smear of mustard on a piece of stale bread with a slice of salty bologna was a classic free lunch combination, a trifecta of thirst-inducing ingredients. There was no mayonnaise. Mayonnaise is an emulsion of eggs and oil, and it would spoil in minutes without refrigeration. The creamy condiments of the modern world were an impossible dream. These condiments were communal. The bottles were sticky, their labels peeling, their contents of indeterminate age. The mustard jar had a single, grimy knife or spoon sticking out of it, used by every customer who came before you. You did not think about the germs. You did not think about the unwashed hands that had handled these bottles. You were driven by a more immediate need. The need to make the food in front of you taste like something, anything, else. You would shake a generous amount of hot sauce into your stew, turning the brown liquid a threatening shade of red. You would spread a thick layer of mustard on your cracker. You would douse your pickled egg in ketchup. You were not enhancing flavors, you were obliterating them. You were using these condiments as a chemical weapon against the blandness, a desperate act of culinary self-defense. And with every spicy, vinegary, salty bite, your thirst grew more intense. The condiments were not an act of kindness from the saloon owner. They were the final, crucial element in his perfectly designed trap. They made the inedible edible, and in doing so, they ensured that you would keep drinking until your pockets were empty. They were the taste of desperation, served up in a sticky, fly-specked bottle. We have deconstructed the food of the free lunch. We have examined its salty meats, its stale breads, and its vinegary vegetables. But we have left out the most prevalent and most dangerous ingredient of all, the one that was present in every single bite you took at the saloon counter: filth. The concept of sanitation, of germ theory, of hygiene as a cornerstone of public health was in its absolute infancy in the late 19th century. In a remote frontier town, it was completely non-existent. The saloon was a petri dish, a thriving ecosystem of bacteria, viruses, and parasites, and the free lunch was its primary delivery system. Let's begin with the hands that prepared the food. As we've discussed, there was no chef. The food was likely handled by the bartender or the swamper. These men were not trained in food safety. Their hands were a roadmap of the saloon's daily grime. They handled money, which was filthy. They handled dirty glasses. They wiped down the sticky bar with a sour-smelling rag. They shook hands with dozens of customers. And they did all of this without ever washing their hands before turning to slice the cheese or ladle the stew. The dishes and utensils were no better. There was no hot running water. The washing station was a tub of cold, greasy, stagnant water, the wreck pan, which was rarely changed. Your tin plate was given a quick dip in this bacterial soup, wiped with a dirty cloth, and then placed back on the stack for the next customer. The forks, knives, and spoons, if any were provided, received the same cursory treatment. You were, in effect, sharing a meal with every person who had eaten in that saloon that day. The food itself was a breeding ground for bacteria. It sat out on the counter for hours, uncovered, at room temperature. In the summer heat, this was a perfect environment for pathogens like Salmonella and E. coli to multiply at an exponential rate. The eternal stew, kept at a low simmer, was often at the ideal temperature not to kill bacteria, but to incubate it. Flies were a constant and accepted feature of the saloon environment. They were everywhere. They swarmed over the food on the lunch counter, landing on the meat, the cheese, the stew. These flies had just come from the piles of manure in the street, from the open pit of the outhouse, from the carcass of a dead animal in the back alley. Each time a fly landed on your food, it was depositing a microscopic payload of filth and disease. The outhouse, the source of much of this contamination, was a horror in itself. It was a shallow pit, buzzing with flies, the stench so powerful it could make you gag from 50 feet away. There was no toilet paper, only a stack of old newspapers or a corn cob. No one washed their hands after using it. The same hands that had just been in that foul-smelling shed were now reaching for the communal tongs to grab a pickled egg. The water source for the town was often a single well, which was frequently located perilously close to the outhouses and the stockyards. Seepage from these sources could easily contaminate the drinking water, leading to outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and dysentery, diseases that could sweep through a town and kill dozens of people. The ice, if the saloon was prosperous enough to have it, was another source of danger. It was harvested in the winter from local ponds or rivers, the same bodies of water that animals drank from, and that received the town's runoff. The ice was stored in sawdust-insulated ice houses and was often cloudy with trapped sediment and bacteria. A cool drink with a chunk of this ice could be a death sentence. When you ate the free lunch, you were not just consuming food, you were consuming a staggering quantity of invisible contaminants. You were ingesting the filth of the street, the bacteria from the outhouse, the germs from a dozen unwashed hands. Your body's only line of defense was a strong stomach and a robust immune system, hardened by a lifetime of exposure to less than ideal conditions. But even the strongest constitution could be overwhelmed. A case of the trots was the best you could hope for. A serious bout of food poisoning, or ptomaine poisoning as they called it, could leave you weak and dehydrated for days. A waterborne illness like cholera could kill you. The great irony of the free lunch is that the food itself, as bad as it was often less dangerous than the environment in which it was served. You were taking a gamble with every bite. The unseen ingredient in every saloon meal was the ever-present, indiscriminate threat of disease. You ate, you drank, and you hoped for the best. Because in this world, hygiene was a luxury no one could afford. Perhaps you are a man of means, or perhaps your stomach rebels at the very sight of the free lunch counter. You decide to pay for a meal. You imagine a thick, juicy steak, a reward for your months of hardship. The saloon does in fact have a paid menu, but it is a short one, and it is fraught with its own set of problems. You signal to the bartender that you'd like to order a steak. He nods and shouts your order to the back room. The price is likely 25 cents. a significant sum, the equivalent of a quarter of a day's wages for you. For that price, you expect something special. The first problem is the meat itself. Where did this steak come from? The cattle you just drove 1,000 miles were destined for the slaughterhouses that supplied the eastern cities. They were not for local consumption. The steak you were about to eat likely came from a local ranch, or perhaps it was a cow that was too old, too sick, or too ornery to make the long trip. The quality of the beef was inconsistent at best. It was not the well-marbled, tender beef of the modern era. This was lean, tough meat from a range-fed animal that had spent its life walking and foraging. The concept of aging beef to improve its flavor and tenderness was a fine dining practice from the East, completely unknown on the frontier. The second problem is storage. As we know, there was no refrigeration. The saloon owner would purchase a side of beef and hang it in a cool, dark back room or a cellar. He would cut off steaks as they were ordered. But in the summer heat, the meat would begin to turn quickly. The saloon cook became an expert at identifying the fine line between aged and spoiled. To mask the taste of meat that was slightly past its prime, it was often marinated in vinegar or heavily seasoned with pepper and salt before cooking. If you ordered your steak and it arrived already covered in a dark sauce, it was a sure sign that the cook was trying to hide something. The third problem is the cooking. You do not get to specify how you would like your steak cooked. There is no medium rare or medium well. There is only one temperature, well done. The steak would be thrown onto a cast iron skillet or a grill over a hot fire and cooked until it was grey, tough and chewy. Why? Firstly, it was a matter of safety. Given the questionable freshness of the meat, cooking it thoroughly was seen as a way to kill any potential pathogens. Secondly, it was a matter of skill. The saloon cook was not a trained chef. He was a short-order cook, in the truest sense of the word, and his primary goal was to cook the meat quickly and without giving the customer food poisoning. Overcooking was the safest and easiest way to achieve this. Your steak arrives on a thick, heavy plate, sizzling in a pool of its own grease. It is accompanied by a pile of fried potatoes, also greasy, and perhaps a dollop of the same vinegary coleslaw from the free lunch counter. You saw into the steak with your knife. It is tough work. The meat is dense and fibrous. You chew on a piece for a long time, your jaw aching with the effort. The flavor is predominantly of beef, yes, but also of char, grease, and the heavy-handed salt and pepper used to season it. It is not a transcendent culinary experience. It is a hearty, if challenging meal. It fills your stomach and provides a welcome change from the monotony of the trail diet, but it is a far cry from the mythical cowboy steak dinner. You might also order other items from the paid menu. Fried chicken was a possibility if the town had a reliable supply. Pork chops were common, but all of these dishes suffered from the same problems. Questionable sourcing, a lack of refrigeration, and a tendency to be overcooked in a sea of grease. Eating a paid meal in a saloon was a step up from the free lunch, but it was a small step. You were still at the mercy of the saloon's primitive kitchen and non-existent sanitation standards. You were paying a premium for a meal that was, by modern standards, poorly prepared and of low quality. But after months of eating beans out of a tin plate, that greasy, tough, overcooked steak felt like a feast for a king. You ate every last bite, wiped your plate clean with a piece of bread, and leaned back, feeling full and content, at least until the indigestion kicked in. Beyond the standard fare of beef and pork, the frontier offered a bounty of wild game. The paid menu in a saloon might, on occasion, feature dishes made from venison, buffalo, rabbit, or various game birds. To a hungry cowboy, this sounded like an exotic and welcome treat, a true taste of the Wild West. But like everything else on the saloon menu, eating wild game was a gamble, a culinary adventure with a significant element of risk. Let's start with buffalo. In the early days of the West, the American bison was plentiful, and its meat was a staple. A saloon might offer a buffalo steak or a buffalo roast. The meat was leaner than beef, with a richer, slightly sweeter flavor. When cooked properly, it could be delicious. However, by the 1880s, the great buffalo herds had been hunted to near extinction. Buffalo meat was becoming a rarity, a novelty item that was often expensive. The problem with buffalo, as with all game, was freshness. A hunter would bring the carcass to town, but there was no telling how long the animal had been dead. In the summer heat, A large animal like a buffalo would begin to spoil quickly. The saloon cook would have to butcher it immediately and cook it or preserve it. Any meat that was not sold right away would be heavily salted or thrown into the eternal stew. Venison, or deer meat, was another common offering. It was lean and had a distinct gamey flavour that many people enjoyed, but it suffered from the same issues of freshness and preservation. A poorly handled deer carcass could result in tough, foul-tasting meat. Then there were the smaller animals. Rabbit stew was a cheap and common dish. It could be quite tasty, but there was a danger known as rabbit starvation. Rabbit meat is incredibly lean, almost completely lacking in fat. A person who tried to subsist on nothing but rabbit meat would be getting protein, but not the essential fatty acids their body needs. They would feel full, but they would slowly starve to death. A strange and cruel paradox of the frontier diet. You might also find prairie chicken, quail, or duck on the menu. These birds were often roasted whole and could be a delicious treat. But again, you had to trust that the hunter had brought them in fresh. There was also the risk of biting down on a piece of lead shot, a painful and potentially tooth-shattering surprise. Perhaps the most significant peril of eating wild game was the risk of disease. Wild animals can carry a host of parasites and bacteria that are harmful to humans. Tularemia, also known as rabbit fever, could be contracted from handling or eating infected rabbits. Trichinosis could be contracted from undercooked bear meat. The saloon cook, with his rudimentary knowledge and his tendency to either overcook or undercook, was not a reliable guardian against these threats. The wild aspect of the game also extended to its preparation. The cook was not a master of French sauces designed to complement the flavour of venison. He was a man with a frying pan and a lot of lard. Your wild game was likely to be treated with the same heavy hand as the beef steak, fried or roasted until tough, and seasoned aggressively to mask any off flavours. So, when you saw venison steak chalked on the saloon slate menu, you were faced with a choice. You could stick with the tough but relatively predictable beef, or you could take a chance on the wild game. It might be the most delicious meal you'd had in a year, or it might be a tough, gamey, and potentially disease-ridden disappointment. Eating wild game in a saloon was a true reflection of the frontier spirit. It was a gamble. It was a walk on the wild side, in more ways than one. It was an embrace of the untamed nature of the West, with all of its potential for reward and its ever-present risk of disaster. Let's be honest. You didn't go to a saloon for the fine dining. You went there to drink. The food, particularly the free lunch, was merely a supporting actor in a drama dominated by alcohol. The entire business model of the saloon was built on selling drinks, and the drinks they sold were as rough, dangerous, and unrefined as the men who consumed them. The king of the saloon was whiskey, but this was not the smooth, complex, barrel-aged bourbon or rye you might be familiar with. This was frontier whiskey, a raw, fiery, and often toxic concoction. It was typically young, unaged grain alcohol, shipped west in barrels from distilleries in the east. It was cheap, it was potent, and it was barely potable in its pure form. So, the saloon owner would rectify it. This was a euphemism for adulterating it with other substances to stretch the supply, to add colour and flavour, and sometimes to increase its perceived potency. The list of additives was a chemical horror show. Burnt sugar or tobacco juice was added for a dark amber colour. Tea or other flavourings might be used to mimic the taste of aged whiskey, but the most dangerous additives were used to give the whiskey a kick. Strychnine, a potent poison, was sometimes added in small quantities to produce a stimulating effect and a bitter taste. Ammonia, turpentine, and even gunpowder were also rumoured to be part of some saloon recipes. This mixture was then diluted with water, bottled, and sold to you as whiskey. The effect of this drink was immediate and brutal. It burned your throat, seared your stomach, and delivered a powerful, disorienting jolt to your nervous system. It got you drunk, yes, but it also poisoned you slowly. The long-term effects of regularly consuming this chemical cocktail were devastating, leading to neurological damage, organ failure, and a host of other health problems. The phrase "rot gut whiskey" was not a metaphor. It was a literal description of what the drink did to your insides. If whiskey was too rich for your blood, the other option was beer. But again, you must banish any thoughts of a cold, crisp, refreshing lager. Beer on the frontier was served warm or at room temperature. Refrigeration was a rare and expensive luxury. The beer was shipped in wooden kegs, and it was often flat and sour by the time it reached the saloon. The quality was highly inconsistent. It was often brewed locally, with little to no quality control, The flavor could be weak and watery or yeasty and unpleasant, but it was cheap, usually 5 cents a glass, and it was wet. It was the beverage of choice for the working man who wanted to quench his thirst without spending his entire day's wages. Wine was available in some of the more upscale saloons, but it was generally of poor quality and was considered a drink for Eastern dandies, not for real men of the West. Other concoctions, like gin or brandy, might be available, but they suffered from the same problems of adulteration and poor quality as the whiskey. It becomes clear why the food was so salty. After a few glasses of this warm, sour beer, or a shot of this fiery, chemical-laden whiskey, your mouth would be as dry as a desert. The salty food created a desperate thirst, and the low-quality alcohol did little to quench it. It was a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle, a perfect engine for profit. You ate the salty food to tolerate the bad drink, and you drank the bad drink to wash down the salty food. The saloon was not a place to savor a fine beverage. It was a place to get intoxicated as quickly and as cheaply as possible. It was a form of self-medication, a way to numb the physical pain of your labor, the emotional pain of your loneliness, and the existential dread of your precarious existence. The drink was the point. The food was just the salty path that led you there. Each glass was a small, temporary escape, purchased at a price that was far higher than the nickel or dime you slapped down on the scarred wooden bar. We have spoken at length about the salt on the crackers, the salt in the stew, the salt encrusting the cured meats, the salt in the brine of the pickled eggs. It was the dominant flavor, the unifying theme of the entire free lunch experience. It is easy to dismiss this as a simple consequence of 19th century food preservation techniques. And while that is part of the story, it misses the larger, more cynical truth. The overwhelming saltiness of the free lunch was not an accident, it was a weapon. The saloon owner was engaged in a form of culinary warfare against your sobriety, and salt was his most effective ammunition. His primary source of income was not the 25-cent steak dinners. It was the 5-cent glasses of beer and the 10-cent shots of whiskey. His entire business model depended on maximizing the number of drinks each customer consumed. The free lunch was the bait, but the salt was the mechanism that drove the transaction. Let's trace the physiology of this strategy. You walk into the saloon, your body dehydrated from a long day on the trail. Your first instinct is to quench your thirst. You order a beer. Then you see the free food. You are starving. You eat a plate of salty sausage, hard cheese, and vinegary onions. The massive influx of sodium begins to work on your body immediately. The salt draws water out of your cells and into your bloodstream in an attempt to maintain equilibrium. Your brain detects this increase in blood sodium concentration and triggers a powerful primal thirst response. Your mouth feels dry. Your throat feels scratchy. Your body is screaming for water to dilute the salt. But you are not going to drink water. Water in a saloon was often free, but it was also of questionable quality and carried the risk of disease. More importantly, drinking water was not the social norm. You were in a saloon. You were there to drink alcohol. So, you order another beer. The cool liquid provides a moment of relief, but beer is a diuretic. It makes you urinate more frequently, causing you to lose water and become even more dehydrated. Furthermore, the alcohol itself is dehydrating. So, while the beer provides temporary relief, it is actually making the underlying problem worse. You take another bite of the salty free lunch. The cycle repeats. The salt makes you thirsty. The thirst makes you drink. The drink makes you more dehydrated and more likely to continue eating the salty food. It is a brilliant, self-sustaining loop of consumption. The saloon owner understood this dynamic with an intuitive, predatory genius. He was not just a publican, he was a practical physiologist. He knew that by providing an endless supply of cheap, salty food, he could create a nearly endless demand for his primary product. Every element of the free lunch was calibrated for maximum thirst induction. The dryness of the crackers, the brine of the pickles, the cured saltiness of the meat was all part of a carefully orchestrated assault on your body's fluid balance. This is why the food was free. The saloon owner was not giving away a meal. He was making an investment. The small cost of the salty food was repaid many times over by the sale of beer and whiskey. The lunch counter was the most profitable piece of real estate in the entire establishment. When you, the weary cowboy, saw the free lunch, you saw an act of generosity. You saw a respite from your hunger. You did not see the invisible hand of commerce, the cynical calculation that was manipulating your own body's chemistry against you. You were a pawn in a game you didn't even know you were playing. The salt was more than just a seasoning. It was the engine of the saloon economy. It was the silent, gritty partner in every transaction. It was the taste of exploitation, the flavor of a perfectly laid trap. And you, with your honest hunger and your powerful thirst, never stood a chance. In a world of questionable whiskey and warm beer, you might wonder why the cowboy didn't simply stick to the most natural and abundant beverage of all, water. The answer is simple and grim. In the 19th century West, a glass of water could be far more dangerous than a shot of rot-gut whiskey. The frontier was a world without water treatment plants, without sanitation systems, and without a scientific understanding of waterborne pathogens. The water that was available was often a breeding ground for diseases that could incapacitate or kill with terrifying speed. Let's consider the water sources in a typical cow town. The primary source was likely a single communal well, dug in the center of town. This well was the lifeblood of the community, but it was also profoundly vulnerable to contamination. The well was often located just yards away from the town's sources of filth, the outhouses, the livery stables, and the pens where livestock were kept. Rainwater would seep through the ground, carrying human and animal waste from these sites directly into the aquifer that fed the well. The concept of a safe distance between a well and a latrine was unknown. As a result, the town's drinking water was often a diluted soup of bacteria like E. coli, Salmonella typhi, the cause of typhoid fever, and Vibrio cholerae, the cause of cholera. If the town was situated on a river, the situation was no better. The river was the town's sewer. Garbage, waste from the slaughterhouses, and raw sewage were all dumped directly into the current. The same river was then used for drinking, cooking, and washing. The idea that a river could purify itself was a common but deadly misconception. A cowboy arriving in town, dehydrated and desperate for a drink, might take a long draught of this contaminated water and, in doing so, sign his own death warrant. An outbreak of a waterborne disease could be devastating. Cholera, in particular, was a horrific and swift killer. A person could be healthy in the morning and dead by nightfall, their body racked by violent diarrhea and vomiting that led to catastrophic dehydration. A cholera epidemic could empty a town in a matter of weeks, leaving behind only fear and shallow graves. Typhoid fever was a slower, more insidious killer. It caused high fevers, delirium, and internal bleeding. It could linger for weeks, and even those who survived were often left weakened and debilitated for life. Given these horrifying risks, it is easy to understand why people preferred to drink alcohol. The brewing process for beer involved boiling the water, which killed most of the dangerous pathogens. The high alcohol content of whiskey also had an antiseptic effect. While the alcohol itself was often a low-grade poison, it was seen as the lesser of two evils. A shot of whiskey might give you a headache, but a glass of water might give you cholera. It was a simple calculation of risk. Even on the trail, finding clean water was a constant challenge. Cowboys would look for clear, running streams, but they had no way of knowing what might be happening upstream. A dead and decaying animal in the water a mile away could contaminate the entire stream. Ponds and waterholes were often stagnant and teeming with algae and bacteria, as well as the parasites left by the hundreds of cattle that had drunk from and defecated in them. Cowboys developed a practical, if imperfect, wisdom about water. They knew to avoid water that was cloudy or had a bad smell. They knew that the water in a barrel on the chuck wagon, which had been drawn from a trusted source, was generally safer than a random stream. And they knew that boiling water, as they did for their coffee, made it safer. The strong, bitter flavor of the coffee was a small price to pay for the relative safety of the beverage. So when you stood in the saloon, faced with the choice of drinks, water was often the last thing on your mind. You chose the beer or the whiskey not just for the intoxicating effect, but for the perceived safety. It was a grim choice, a selection from a menu of potential poisons. But in a world where a simple glass of water could kill you, the burn of cheap whiskey felt like a safer bet. The most dangerous drink in the saloon was the one they gave away for free. While the saloon and its free lunch represented the lowest common denominator of frontier dining, it was not the only option available in a cow town. If you had the money and the desire for a slightly more civilized experience, you might bypass the saloon's offerings and seek out a proper restaurant or the dining room of the town's hotel. The distinction was significant, and it highlights the stratified nature of the frontier food scene. The saloon was, first and foremost, a bar. Food was a secondary concern, a tool to promote the sale of alcohol. The restaurant or hotel dining room, on the other hand, was in the business of selling meals. This fundamental difference in purpose was reflected in every aspect of the dining experience, from the atmosphere to the quality of the food itself. Walking into a town restaurant was a different experience from entering a saloon. The room was likely to be cleaner, quieter, and better lit. The floors would be wood, not covered in sawdust. The tables would be covered with checkered tablecloths, a small but significant touch of domesticity. The clientele was also different. You would see families, respectable merchants and travellers, not just the rough-and-tumble crowd of cowboys and drifters that populated the saloon. The menu, while still limited by the constraints of the frontier supply chain, was more extensive and ambitious than the saloon's offerings. You would still find the ubiquitous steak and potatoes, but it was more likely to be prepared with a bit more care. You might have a choice of side dishes, perhaps some canned vegetables like peas or corn, a welcome novelty after a diet of beans. The restaurant might also offer more sophisticated dishes, reflecting the culinary aspirations of the East. You might find oyster stew, a surprising but popular dish on the frontier. Oysters were canned and shipped west by the railroad, and they were considered a great luxury, a taste of the distant ocean in the middle of the plains. You might also find roasted chicken, meat pies, or even a simple soup that wasn't the eternal stew of the saloon. The key difference was the expectation of freshness, however relative that term might be. The restaurant owner, unlike the saloon keeper, was staking his reputation on the quality of his food. He had a greater incentive to source the best available ingredients and to avoid serving meat that was on the verge of spoiling. His prices were higher, but with that came an implicit promise of a better, safer meal. The sanitation, while still falling far short of modern standards, was likely to be a step up from the saloon. The kitchen was a dedicated space, not a dark back room. The person cooking the food was a cook, not a bartender pulling double duty. The dishes were more likely to be washed with hot water. The risk of food poisoning was still present, but it was lower. However, this better experience came at a price. A full meal in a restaurant could cost 50 cents to $1, a substantial portion of your monthly wages. For the average cowboy, who had just been paid after months of labor, the temptation was to spend his money on the immediate gratification of the saloon's liquor, while subsisting on its free, if hazardous, lunch. The restaurant was a luxury, an indulgence for a special occasion, or for the town's small middle class. The existence of these two parallel dining worlds, the cheap, salty, and dangerous food of the saloon, and the more expensive, more civilized, but still limited food of the restaurant, reveals a great deal about the social structure of the frontier. The saloon was the great equalizer, a democratic space where all men, regardless of their background, could partake in the same low-quality food and drink. The restaurant was a marker of status, a place where one could purchase a small piece of the refinement and comfort that had been left behind in the East. Your choice of where to eat was not just a culinary decision, it was a statement about your place in the world. Were you a transient laborer, content with the rough fare of the saloon? Or were you an aspiring citizen, willing to pay a premium for a clean tablecloth and a steak that wasn't cooked to the consistency of shoe leather? Most cowboys, their pockets full for the first time in months, but their futures uncertain, chose the former. The restaurant was a dream of a more stable life. The saloon was the reality of the present moment. The celebration is over. The last of your wages have been spent on whiskey, poker, and fleeting companionship. You stumble out of the saloon's swinging doors and into the pre-dawn darkness of the cow town. Your head is pounding, your mouth is dry, and your stomach is a churning cauldron of rebellion. You have survived the free lunch, but now you must face the consequences. The combination of cheap, adulterated alcohol and salty, greasy, bacterially diverse food wreaks havoc on your digestive system. The most immediate and common consequence is a profound case of indigestion. A burning, acidic fire crawls up your esophagus. Your stomach feels bloated and heavy, a leaden weight in your gut. You are likely to spend a good portion of the night groaning in your cheap hotel bed. Or, if you couldn't afford a room, in a livery stable, your sleep punctuated by sharp, stabbing pains. Then comes the trots, the grimly accepted euphemism for a bout of violent diarrhea. The eternal stew, the questionable sausage, the unwashed hands of the swampersome combination of these has introduced a hostile army of bacteria into your intestines, and your body is now engaged in a desperate, full-scale evacuation. This involves multiple, urgent trips to the foul-smelling outhouse, a journey that feels like a walk of shame in the dead of night. The diarrhea leaves you weak, dehydrated, and miserable. Vomiting is also a distinct possibility. Your stomach, pushed to its absolute limit, may decide to reject its toxic contents in a single, convulsive eruption. This provides a moment of grim relief, but it leaves you shaky and empty, your throat burning from the stomach acid. These acute symptoms are so common that they are simply considered part of the experience of seeing the town. Cowboys would trade stories of their digestive misadventures with a kind of dark, fatalistic humor. It was a shared misery, a testament to their endurance. But the consequences are not just temporary. The long-term effects of this diet and lifestyle are insidious and severe. The constant consumption of rot-gut whiskey, with its toxic additives, slowly damages your liver, your kidneys, and your nervous system. The high-salt, low-fiber, low-vitamin diet leads to a host of chronic health problems. Dental issues are a near certainty. The lack of vitamin C from scurvy weakens the gums, while the hard, gritty food wears down the teeth. Without any form of dental care beyond extraction, most cowboys suffered from chronic toothaches, abscesses, and the eventual loss of most of their teeth. An old cowboy was often a toothless one. Chronic gastritis, ulcers, and other digestive ailments were also common. The constant assault of harsh food and drink on the stomach lining took its toll over the years. Many cowboys suffered from a constant, low-level sour stomach, which they treated with ineffective patent medicines or more whiskey, perpetuating the cycle of damage. The nutritional deficiencies had other, more subtle effects. Your body's ability to heal was compromised. Minor injuries lingered. Your immune system was weakened, making you more susceptible to infectious diseases like pneumonia or tuberculosis, which were rampant in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of the bunkhouses and cheap lodging houses. So as you lie there in the dark, your body waging a war against the meal you so eagerly consumed, you are experiencing the true cost of the saloon experience. It was not just the money you lost. It was a mortgage taken out against your own health, a debt that would be paid over years of chronic pain and illness. The myth of the cowboy is one of rugged, vibrant health, of a man at one with nature. The reality was a slow, grinding breakdown of the human body under conditions of extreme stress, poor nutrition, and non-existent medical care. The saloon, with its promise of pleasure and escape, was often the epicenter of this breakdown. It offered a few hours of oblivion, but the price was paid in the quiet, miserable hours of the night, and in the years of health that were stolen from you, one salty, greasy, whiskey-soaked meal at a time. In your modern world, a meal can be many things. It can be a culinary adventure, a social celebration, a quiet moment of comfort. In the world of the frontier saloon, eating was none of these things. It was a social ritual, governed by a harsh, unspoken code, and its purpose was not pleasure, but survival and the reinforcement of a brutal social hierarchy. When you bellied up to the free lunch counter, you entered a space with its own set of rules. The first rule was that you did not linger. This was not a place for conversation or for savouring your food. You were there to eat quickly and get out of the way. The counter was a small, crowded space, and there were other hungry men waiting. You took your plate, you ate your food while standing at the bar, and you moved on. Eating was a solitary act, even when performed in a crowd. The second rule was that you did not complain. The food was free. Complaining about it was the height of bad manners. It didn't matter if the stew tasted of old boots, if the bread was mouldy, or if the pickled egg had the consistency of a rubber ball. You ate what was offered, and you kept your opinions to yourself. To complain was to brand yourself as a greenhorn, a man who did not understand the harsh realities of the world. The veteran cowboys ate in a grim, stoic silence. They had seen worse. The third rule, as we have touched on, was that you did not take too much. The free lunch was a communal offering, and taking more than your fair share was a serious social transgression. It marked you as greedy and selfish, a man who did not respect the needs of the group. The bartender's watchful eye was a powerful deterrent. A quiet word from him, "Think that's enough for now, partner?" was a public shaming that you would not soon forget. The act of eating itself was stripped of all refinement. You used your fingers or a pocket knife. You speared a piece of sausage. You grabbed a cracker. You popped a pickled egg into your mouth. There was no ceremony. It was a purely functional act, the human equivalent of an animal at a feeding trough. This public, functional approach to eating reflected the broader realities of a cowboy's life. It was a life devoid of privacy and comfort. You lived, worked, and slept in the constant company of other men. Your personal habits were public knowledge. In the same way that you relieved yourself a few feet from the campsite, you ate your meals standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers, your shared hunger the only thing connecting you. But even in this crude ritual, there was a subtle social dynamic at play. The way a man approached the free lunch said something about him. The confident veteran who took a small plate without hesitation, the nervous newcomer who glanced around before taking a single cracker, the town drunk who tried to stuff his pockets with cheese when the bartender wasn't looking. Each of these was a character in a small daily drama. The free lunch was also a great leveler. At that counter, the trail-weary cowboy stood next to the failed prospector, the down-on-his-luck gambler, and the local loafer. Their shared need for a free meal erased. For a moment, their different histories and future prospects. They were all just hungry men, partaking in the same salty, questionable bounty. This ritual was a microcosm of the frontier's social code. It was a world that valued stoicism, pragmatism, and a fierce, if unspoken, sense of communal etiquette. It was a world that had no time for weakness, for complaint, or for the niceties of civilized dining. You learned the rules quickly, you ate your food in silence, and you ordered another beer. It was the only way to survive, both nutritionally and socially, in the rough-and-tumble world of the frontier saloon. The image is burned into our collective consciousness. It is the climax of 1,000 westerns. The hero, having dispatched the villains, walks into the saloon. The piano player stops. The crowd murmurs. He walks to the bar and orders a steak and a bottle of the best whiskey. He sits at a table, and a beautiful saloon girl brings him a sizzling platter. He eats a hearty, satisfying meal, the just reward for his heroism. This is the myth. By now, you know the reality. The myth is one of abundance and reward. The reality was one of scarcity and exploitation. The mythical cowboy eats a meal that is a symbol of his triumph. The real cowboy ate a free lunch that was a symbol of his desperation, a tool designed to part him from his meager wages. The myth is one of pristine, high-quality food. The thick, juicy steak, the fresh-baked bread, the golden whiskey. The reality was one of preserved, adulterated, and often spoiled ingredients. The tough, gristly steak of questionable origin. The stale, weevil-infested crackers. The raw, chemical-laden rot-gut whiskey. The myth is one of cleanliness and order. The sparkling clean glasses, the polished wooden bar, the well-swept floor. The reality was one of pervasive filth. The sawdust-covered floor soaked with spit and beer. The greasy, unwashed plates. The swarms of flies and the ever-present threat of invisible, deadly bacteria. The myth is one of service and hospitality. The friendly, talkative bartender. The charming saloon girl, the efficient cook. The reality was one of cynical transaction. The indifferent bartender whose only goal was to keep you drinking. The exploited saloon girl selling a fantasy of companionship. The non-existent chef, replaced by a swamper with unwashed hands. Why is the myth so different from the reality? Why did we, as a culture, choose to remember the fantasy and forget the foul-tasting truth? The myth of the saloon meal serves the same purpose as the myth of the heroic gunfight. It sanitizes a harsh and often ugly reality. It transforms a story of labor and exploitation into a story of freedom and adventure. It takes the weary, malnourished, working-class cowboy and turns him into a self-sufficient hero. The myth arose in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, at a time when America was rapidly industrializing and urbanizing. People living in crowded cities, working in monotonous factories, longed for a simpler, more heroic past. They craved stories of wide-open spaces, of rugged individualism, of a world where a man was judged by his character, not his bank account. The Western myth provided this escape. The saloon became a stage, and the meal became a prop in this national drama. The hearty steak dinner was a symbol of the bounty of the West, of the rewards that awaited those with courage and fortitude. It was a comforting fantasy that ignored the reality of scurvy, food poisoning, and the eternal stew. It is a more pleasant story to believe that the men who tamed the West were well-fed heroes, not underpaid laborers subsisting on pickled pig's feet. It is more reassuring to imagine a world of simple, honest fare than a world of adulterated whiskey and bacterial warfare. But by understanding the reality of the saloon meal, we gain a deeper and more profound appreciation for the men who actually lived it. Their story is not one of culinary delight, but of incredible endurance. They did not just face down outlaws and stampedes, they faced down ptomaine poisoning, chronic malnutrition, and a diet that would make a modern human physically ill. The real meal of the cowboy was not a reward for his heroism. It was simply another one of the hardships he had to endure. The fact that he did so, day after day, with a stoic, uncomplaining resilience, is a testament to a kind of strength that is far more impressive than the fictional heroics of the myth. The myth is a good story, but the truth, in all its gritty, unsanitary, and foul-tasting glory, is a better one. The era of the free lunch and the rot-gut saloon did not last forever. As the West became more settled, as towns grew into cities, and as the railroad brought the products and standards of the East, the culinary landscape began to change. The free lunch was eventually outlawed in many places, seen as a corrupting influence and a public health hazard. The quality of food and drink slowly, incrementally, improved. But the legacy of this era of survival eating did not disappear entirely. It left a faint, ghostly imprint on American foodways, a subtle echo of the pragmatism, the preservation techniques, and the flavor profiles of the frontier. Consider the enduring American love for salty snacks. The Cracker Barrel, the bowl of pretzels, the jar of peanuts on a modern Barthes are the direct descendants of the saloon's free lunch. The principle remains the same: provide a cheap, salty, and shelf-stable snack to encourage the sale of drinks. The ingredients are safer now, but the business logic is a straight line from the 19th century saloon. The American palate's affinity for bold, strong flavors can also be seen as a legacy of this period. When your base ingredients are bland and of low quality, you learn to rely on powerful condiments. The widespread use of hot sauce, the popularity of sharp, tangy mustards, and the love for smoky barbecue sauces all have roots in a culinary tradition where the sauce was often more important than the thing it was being put on. It's a flavor profile born of the need to mask, to overwhelm, to transform. The ingenuity of frontier preservation also left its mark. Techniques like smoking, curing, and pickling, while ancient in origin, were perfected and popularized in the American West out of sheer necessity. The tradition of beef jerky, the variety of cured sausages, and the culture of home canning and pickling that persists in many parts of the country are all part of this legacy. They are the culinary skills of a people who could not afford to let anything go to waste. But perhaps the most significant legacy is a psychological one. The frontier experience embedded a certain pragmatism into the American approach to food. For much of its history, for many of its people, food was seen primarily as fuel. It was about calories, about sustenance, about getting through the day. The European ideal of the long, leisurely meal, of food as a central cultural and social ritual, never took root in the same way. American food culture has often been characterized by speed, convenience, and functionality. The drive-through, the TV dinner, the quick lunch break. This is in part the legacy of a nation shaped by a frontier where there was simply no time to linger over a meal. The work was always waiting. The saloon meal, in all its horror, was a perfect expression of this ethos. It was fast. It was functional. It was ruthlessly efficient. It stripped the act of eating down to its most basic, biological purpose. When we look at the evolution of American cuisine, we can see the faint outlines of that dusty saloon counter. We see the ghost of the eternal stew in our love for one-pot meals and slow-cooker recipes. We see the shadow of the free lunch in our bar snack culture. We see the echo of the rot-gut whiskey in our appreciation for strong, bold flavors. The food of the Old West saloon may have sucked, but it was not without influence. It was a product of its time and place, a harsh and unforgiving culinary world that shaped the tastes and habits of a nation in ways we are still unpacking today. It is a reminder that what we eat is not just a matter of taste, but a reflection of our history, our economy, and our deepest, most primal struggle for survival. So, the swinging doors finally close behind you. You step out from the dark, smoky, and dangerously aromatic world of the frontier saloon, and back into the honest, if equally harsh light of day. Your ears are ringing, your stomach is churning with a volatile mixture of cheap whiskey and questionable sausage, and your pockets are significantly lighter than when you entered. You have partaken in the legendary saloon experience, and you have survived. For now, the journey we've taken tonight was not one of high adventure or noble deeds. It was a descent into the forgotten, unglamorous, and often disgusting reality of the food that fueled the American West. We have peered into the murky depths of the eternal stew, gnawed on the unyielding hardness of stale crackers, and braved the vinegary depths of the pickled egg jar. We have understood that the free lunch was never free, and that salt was the currency of a cynical and brilliant business model. We have learned that the greatest threat in the saloon was not the gunfighter in the corner, but the bacteria on the plate, that the whiskey was a chemical gamble, and the water was an even greater one. We have seen how the myth of the hearty cowboy feast was constructed to cover a truth of malnutrition, exploitation, and profound culinary despair. This was not boring history. This was the history of the body, of the senses. It was a story told in flavors and smells, in stomachaches and moments of fleeting, salty satisfaction. It reminds us that the grand, sweeping narratives of history of westward expansion, of manifest destiny, of the taming of a continent were built on the small, mundane, and often miserable details of daily existence. Before a nation could be built, a man had to eat, and the food he ate, in all its salty, preserved, and unhygienic glory, tells us more about the true nature of his life than any heroic myth ever could. It tells a story of endurance, of pragmatism, of the incredible resilience of the human body and spirit in the face of conditions that would sicken and defeat most of us today. So, the next time you sit down to a meal, in the comfort of your clean modern world, with its fresh ingredients and its refrigerated supply chains, perhaps you will take a moment to think of your ancestor at the saloon counter. Think of him, standing in the sawdust, a tin plate in his hand, contemplating a rubbery pig's foot and a glass of warm, sour beer. He was not a hero from a movie. He was a hungry man, in a hard world, making the best of a very bad meal. And in his quiet, uncomplaining endurance, there is a kind of dignity, a kind of strength, that is worth remembering. It is the real, and far more interesting, taste of the Old West.